Hi, my name's Andrew Dudley and this is Air for Live, a webcast featuring interviews with people working on the front lines of conservation. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Bruce Hamilton in Berkeley. How are you doing, Bruce?
I'm just fine, thank you.
So can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Well, now I am the National Policy Director for the Sierra Club. So the Sierra Club is primarily a domestic, but we do operate internationally as well, conservation organization. We've been around over 125 years, started in 1892. We work on everything from climate justice to pollution issues to wilderness and parks. And we've got about 3.7 million members and supporters. So it's the largest grassroots-based organization with a political focus, focused on changing public policy.
Brilliant, thanks for that. And can I ask you, so as a young person growing up, what was your kind of first experience with nature? When did you realize that you were going to devote your career to conservation?
Well, I'd say my first experience is when my father's sweeping pine needles out of my diapers. He was a forest ecologist, and I ended up going camping and hiking and canoeing with him every year of my life, starting in my infancy. But I really got serious about it, around the first Earth Day, 1970. I was in college. I was looking for what I wanted to do and finally settled on trying to be an environmental advocate.
And what was that period of time like? I mean, you had the Vietnam War protests that were going on. I mean, for a young man at the time, were you involved in that as well? Or were you really just kind of focusing in on the environmental side?
Well, while I was in high school, getting ready for draft age, and draft was looming over me, I was involved in anti-war protests. We had a local chapter of Students for Democratic Society at the high school, and we would do protests. And when I went to college, I was involved in that. I filed for conscientious objector status because I didn't believe that this war was moral and just, and I couldn't see myself going overseas. But at the same time, there was a growing movement to work on, the environmental issues. The Cuyahoga River had caught fire. The Santa Barbara oil spill had happened. You couldn't see across the street because of the pollution in downtown Los Angeles. And so the first Earth Day came up too. And so simultaneously, you'd have millions of people in the streets fighting the war and millions of people in the streets saying that we got to take action on climate. And some people saw those as competitive issues, and I saw them as complementary and part of the same root problem where, large corporations and moneyed interests were both driving a war and also polluting the planet.
And you mentioned the Earth Day, so it was around about this time that the first colour photograph was taken of Earth. It's, as you know, called Earthrise. Do you remember that being published for the first time? Was that like a real pivotal moment in the conservation movement?
Well, people tell me it was a pivotal moment. I recall seeing the image, but I didn't suddenly have an aha moment and say, oh, this is going to transform my life. It's just like, I can't remember exactly when somebody first stepped on the moon. But, that aside, I do think that it symbolized a larger issue, which was this is the only place in the universe that we know that, has life as we know it. And as a result, it's really precious. And if we destroy it and make it uninhabitable, there isn't another planet to go to. And so it really gave people a new perspective. I sort of recognized that looking from the Earth up, other people, might have looked at from space down. But in either case, you come to the same conclusion. And that's that we got to take care of this important, nurturing environment. And if we don't, it's at our own peril.
So what did you study at university and when did you first get involved with the Sierra Club?
Well, I went to a hippie university, and so I was just studying social justice and change, but I ultimately got involved in sort of the environmental politics side of it. And at first I thought I wanted to be a marine biologist. I tried that for a while and went out to sea, and then ultimately decided I was more interested in the terrestrial side of things. So I studied wildlife biology in college, but I was never interested in going to work for the game and fish and figure out how to make more huntable and fishable species. I was interested in protecting habitats and protecting species from exploitation. And so I got a minor in what was called Natural Resources Administration, but it was basically trying to figure out the politics around protecting things. And so I started an environmental club at Colorado State University, where I went. Ultimately got involved in writing articles to protest the desecration of various areas. After college, I started working for an environmental consulting firm, writing environmental impact statements, where I would study oil shale development or dams that were being proposed for water development to supply water for Denver. But in each case, I would argue against the project, and then they would turn around and pay me for the study, and then they'd go build the project anyway. So it got quite frustrating. I thought it was kind of being a biostitute, so I quit. And at the same time, my boss said, you're not being loyal because people are paying you to come up with these answers, and you're using it in order to go fight the projects that are feeding you. And so I just gave up on that and switched over to advocacy. First, I was in advocacy journalism. I ran a small little environmental advocacy journal called High Country News in Wyoming that covered the Northern Rockies and Great Plains and the whole energy development thing. And then I switched over to the Sierra Club in 1977. Been there ever since.
Amazing. And can you tell us a bit of background as to how the Sierra Club came to be founded? I mean, what was the inspiration behind that?
So, there was a growing interest in protecting the environment that occurred in the late 1800s. The first area in the United States that was ever set aside was actually Yosemite Park. But it wasn't a national park at that time. There were no national parks. And this actually precedes Yellowstone, which is the first national park. It was during the height of the Civil War, 1864. And basically, people that had seen Yosemite and thought it was a place that deserved protection lobbied the Congress in order to see it protected. And since we didn't have a national park system, they basically gave it to the state of California in order to protect in perpetuity as a public pleasuring ground and park, where there wouldn't be logging and there wouldn't be mining. This all precedes the Sierra Club. But ultimately, a bunch of people who became familiar with Yosemite and entranced by its natural beauty decided that they wanted to expand the park and provide greater protection for the surrounding watershed, and that one of the best ways to do that was to gather together as a group of citizens to promote this kind of protection for the greater Yosemite area. And so a bunch of people centered around San Francisco, including a ringleader named John Muir, basically came together and came up with a proposal, wrote a series of popular articles, lobbied the Congress, and managed to pass a Yosemite expansion bill that basically meant it no longer just protected Yosemite Valley floor and one little grove of giant sequoias, but instead it was the entire area that you now see protected today. And then that group decided to stay intact and found the Sierra Club in order to explore, enjoy, and protect and render accessible the wild areas in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. So it was pretty much a California hiking club, but it had a real conservation bent instead of just being people who were out climbing peaks for the glory of being on top. And then over time and over the decades, it expanded to ultimately become a national and then an international force. It started out primarily interested in land protection for wilderness and national parks, and ultimately expanded the agenda to include pollution and later on climate justice.
So looking back when you first started at the Sierra Club was 1977. So how has membership changed from then till now? And how is the makeup of the membership? Is it more younger people now, or is it still a good mix?
Well, the Sierra Club and most large traditional older mainstream conservation groups are primarily white and primarily older and primarily affluent and college educated. We're trying to change that. It's not only good for the future of the organization, but also you have to listen to those voices and let those voices lead and lift them up and you do need to look like and represent the agenda of broader America instead of a more affluent, narrow, white constituency. So that's part of the change. But the other change is that when the Sierra Club was founded, it was basically a club. And the club meant that you were only invited in by invitation only and had to have sponsors. And as a result, it stayed small and tight-knit and self-replicating. So if it was primarily founded by white affluent people, guess who would they invite in order to be their fellow members, but more white affluent people? And as a result, it wasn't specifically discriminatory. It didn't say we aren't going to let in, blacks or Latinos or Native Americans. But on the other hand, it was hardly welcoming because, it was this self-replicating and narrow focused thing that was just a group of friends. It took until the 1950s to really bust that open and remove the requirement of having sponsorship and start doing broad membership solicitations. So up until the 1950s, it remained a California-based hiking club. There were no chapters outside of California. And it's only since the 1950s that they started having a chapter in Washington State, and then a chapter in the Southwest, and then a chapter representing everybody east of the Mississippi River. But then by the time I joined the staff, we had chapters and groups, in all 50 states, and then ultimately it also expanded to Puerto Rico. But it took time, and at the same time, it needed to stop being so internally focused. We used to think that the way that we would influence public policy is by mobilizing our own members. So it was pre-computers, pre-fax machines, and we would basically call up people or send a mail alert and try to get 100 or 200 of our members to write a letter and mobilize our own members, and that was the way we would try to influence public policy. And since nobody else was really doing that, that was enough. Mm-hmm. But over time, as technology changed and everybody else started doing that, we realized that in fact it was insufficient just to mobilize the Sierra Club membership. It was insufficient just to mobilize the environmental communities membership. That we really had to reach far beyond there onto Main Street. We had to try to get the environmental dialogue happening in the local coffee shops. We needed to get the chambers of commerce and the local wilderness outfitters and the environmental justice frontline communities who were suffering from the pollution also engaged and involved, and their voices lift up and have a broader coalition. And so the Sierra Club changed its orientation from internal organization to external organization. And at first it was all in-person organizing because we didn't really have the digital tools that were necessary. And ultimately, as those digital tools were developed, we turned to both online organizing and in-person organizing. And that is where we're at today. The other thing is that the Sierra Club, unlike almost any other environmental organization in the country, has the entire tool chest of options available. So we not only have a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., in fact, we've got 40 there, but we also have lobbyists in every state capital. We also lobby in city councils. We also have a whole communications and digital organizing enterprise. We used to publish books. We used to make movies and get them out. Each time there's a new communications mode, we would shift into that in order to try to reach the most people possible. We also realized that it was less essential to have everybody join the Sierra Club and then those would be the members that we would speak to and mobilize. But frankly, if somebody just wanted to show up for a march or show up for a letter writing party or show up for a protest, that was fine too. And so now we have both members and supporters. The supporters contribute by basically taking so many actions a year. And as a result, we include them in our network and we give them free information and we invite them into our trainings and they become equal partners in this thing. We ultimately encourage them to also join the Sierra Club, but if they choose not to, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is to be active and engaged and involved. And then lastly, we try to avoid being the dominant premier voice that's putting ourself and our own interests out front. So the more that we can lift up voices that have not been heard, that are vital to this debate. So if there are Native American voices that are impacted by a project and they don't really have the ways to reach the media or the key decision makers in Washington, we want to try to help facilitate that so that they can speak for themselves instead of us trying to speak for them and then take credit for it and then raise money around it. So the same goes for, the environmental justice community. We have environmental justice organizers, but their goal is not to put the Sierra Club name out front, but rather it's to find out what the environmental justice community wants. Do they want to invite us in to help them or not? And then if they do, how can we be helpful behind the scenes so that they can increase their membership, increase their fundraising, increase their clout, raise up their voice so that they can be successful with the goals that they have. And when they succeed, we succeed.
Brilliant. So I'm curious to ask you, how have different presidents and government policies helped to increase membership for the Sierra Club over the years?
Well, it's a very complex thing because every time you elect somebody who is a better environmental candidate, so when Barack Obama was elected, or Bill Clinton was elected, or now Joe Biden is elected, each time you think, great success, now we can move forward. Unfortunately, at that time, lots of people then think, the problem is solved. I no longer need to join and participate and march and hold these elected officials into account and hold their feet to the fire too. Mm-hmm. So we tend to see fundraising and membership and participation drop off whenever we finally get some hands on the reins of power. On the other hand, every time something bad happens where George Bush is elected or Donald Trump is elected, we then see membership soar, but at the same time, we no longer control the Congress, control the White House, and it's largely defensive action. And it's really a mistake and a real problem for us and a problem for moving forward. That when you finally have a window of opportunity, like 8 years of Obama in the White House, you should have been making leaps and bound progress on climate justice. And instead, we see there were fairly tepid steps that were tried to be made. Ultimately, they were unable to even pass a tepid climate bill through the Congress. And then they did a bunch of things with executive action that Trump then undid. And so we basically ended up with, 8 lost years and then 4 on top of that with Trump. Mm-hmm. So I think the real challenge for us right now with Biden, presuming that he either has a narrowly Democratic Congress or a split Congress, is how in the world can you move things forward and get people excited so that they don't think, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are in power, so therefore there's nothing to do. We need to build on the proactive, committed Congress so that in the off-year election in 2 years, we're building climate majorities, and then 4 years from now, even more. Routinely what happens is every time a president comes in, his party loses seats in the off-year election. We can't make that happen. We can't let that happen. And so we just got to keep active and keep involved and keep the urgency going and recognize that Joe Biden isn't going to do this on his own. Politicians are like flotsam and jetsam on the body politic. Mm-hmm. And it's up to us to build the demand so that it makes it easy for Joe Biden to make good decisions, because otherwise he will cut bad compromises. Mm-hmm. So how do we raise the aspiration of the Paris Climate Agreement? It's not enough to just re-enter it, but we've got to go back in with a national commitment, and all the other major countries and polluters need to do the same so that we can actually keep pollution down below 1.5 degrees Celsius increase.
So in 2017, you gave a speech at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco to celebrate the 125-year anniversary of the Sierra Club. It was really inspiring to read that speech. I will link to it as well in the interview. But can you take us through a couple of the kind of proudest achievements that you feel that the Sierra Club has achieved over the years, please?
Yeah, well, as I say, between our founding in 1892 and 1950, we were basically just involved in land protection, and we're a California group. So, a lot of what we did was expand Yosemite National Park, create Giant Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park, protect a bunch of areas primarily in California and a couple outside that we contributed to, but it wasn't much. Come the late 1950s and early 1960s, we get involved in fights over large hydroelectric power. So there's proposals to put dams in the Grand Canyon, for example, as a way of producing hydroelectric power and providing water for Arizona to let the desert bloom. The Sierra Club really took that on in a big way and defeated both those dams, and in the process turned into a nationally prominent conservation organization that people from Georgia and Florida to Alaska wanted to join, as opposed to, because they realized it wasn't just a California hiking club anymore, and that we were going to be feisty and we were going to be politically active. That was the first time we ever had any professional staff. Up until the 1950s, there were no staff. We then had one person, David Brower, our first executive director, and he led that campaign on the Grand Canyon. But that campaign on the Grand Canyon, which involved transformative campaign tools. We were running full-page ads in the New York Times for the first time ever on an issue anywhere, environmental or whatever, with little clip coupons saying, if you want to save the Grand Canyon, clip this and send it back to the Sierra Club. We had a book on the Grand Canyon. We had a movie on the Grand Canyon. We would go around and run rallies on the Grand Canyon. And that prominence and using all those campaign tools ultimately managed to defeat these dams that were promoted by all the water buffaloes throughout the West, including Democrats and Republicans. And we stopped it all from happening. And so that was transformative, but it was still just land protection. And then come 1970, with the first Earth Day, the Sierra Club moves into the direction of ultimately saying we're going to work on air pollution and water pollution and pesticides and Superfund toxic waste and things like that. And so that whole agenda then came forward and moved into the arena of action. During that time, at first, what we were doing in the energy and climate space was trying to clean up some existing coal-fired power plants, presuming that they were just going to still be there. So we would put scrubbers on the stacks and consider that victory. Mm-hmm. We would seek to have reclamation on the strip mines and consider that a victory. But renewable energy at that time was not ripe enough to look at it as a feasible alternative. But once it became a feasible alternative, and also once we realized that climate change was happening, and it was happening because of fossil fuels, there was a rapid transition to figure out how do we wean ourselves from fossil fuels as quickly as possible, and how do we ramp up clean energy as quickly as possible, both for the pollution and justice side of things and also for the climate change side of things. And so that became the new prominent agenda. You asked about sort of the key things that I'm most proud of. I mean, in my first battles that I was involved in the late 70s, were trying to pass and then secure the Alaska Natural Interest Lands Protection Act, the Alaska Lands Act, which basically protected 120 million acres of public land in Alaska. It doubled the size of the national park system. It doubled the size of the wild and scenic rivers system. It provided for the native people up there to have their own land selections so that they could be treated in a just and equitable way, and it gave them subsistence rights so that they could continue to hunt and fish on the areas that we had set aside for protection. So it was really a monumental, probably the biggest land conservation protection effort that ever happened in the country, and I was a part of it, and the club was the main spark plug of it. There was something called the Alaska Coalition, but the club provided the real muscle in order to get that through. But as I was looking back at 125 years of Sierra Club action and progress, and we helped pass the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and the Superfund law. Those are all good milestones that build up the protective force that ultimately helps us protect the environment on a daily basis, because we can then go sue on all these laws, because each one had a citizen suit provision in it, which was absolutely vital. But I then realized that the transformation that the Sierra Club had made since the 1990s up until the time I gave this speech to recognize our role in causing an environmental crisis to occur in frontline communities because we ignored them, and then recognizing that environmental injustice and the fact that the large polluting facilities always got sited in low-income, people of color communities that were disempowered, and the Sierra Club wasn't doing anything about that. And yet we were claiming all these victories, that we had an important role to play in undoing that damage and in saying, mea culpa, we're part of the problem, we need to be part of the solution. And so from 1990 on, with our environmental justice program, we've been steadily working to make amends and to try to lift up those voices and change the way we operate and make sure that we aren't complicit in this any longer, and instead we're part of the solution. And that all solutions going forward, it needs to be climate justice, it needs to be environmental justice, it can't just be environmental protection and conservation as it was prior to that time. And so that transformation that the Sierra Club has made, saying it's a requirement that every one of our staff members, every one of our chapter leaders, every one of our board members go through justice, equity, and inclusion training. That every one of our campaign plans has to have an environmental justice and equity and inclusion platform and basis for it. That we adopted the Jemez principles of climate justice and environmental justice organizing, which is basically to always consult with and lift up the voices of frontline communities and let them lead and let them be heard, instead of just presuming we're the smart kids on the block and we can come in with solutions and be the white saviors. And so that transformation, I think, not only was very much long overdue, but also it was something that is setting up the Sierra Club for the next 125 years. That if we hadn't made that kind of transformation, we would have quickly been obsolete and did not deserve a renewal on life. And so that's the thing that excites me the most when I look forward, is what the Sierra Club can do in the future with the new approach and the new partnerships that we have that are going to create a much larger, broader, more powerful, more impactful, and more just approach to environmental solutions.
And can I also ask you about the Utah Bears Ears National Monument? How did that come about? And I love the name, by the way. Can you give us a bit of background to how that name was decided upon?
Yeah, so in southeastern Utah, there is a place called the Bears Ears. It's a red rock desert wilderness, but if you look at one of the buttes, it's got two prominent rock formations sticking out of the top that look a little bit like bear's ears. So that particular butte is called the Bears Ears. And then as a result, the surrounding environment where we were proposing, along with 5 different tribes to protect, is called the Bears Ears. And again, we didn't come forward and say, boy, we've got a great idea. This would be wonderful for backpacking. Mm-hmm. But instead, we approached the tribes that regard this land as sacred. And it was their lands originally. It's occupied territory now that was stolen from them. And, so we said, let's do some just amends here. What are your interests? How would you like to see this land managed? How would you like to see this land protected? How can we make sure that the sacred sites that you recognize in this place are protected? How would you like to have your tribal members be able to use this land? And how would you like to make sure that it wasn't abused in certain ways? And, we want to follow your lead in this, and then lift up your voices and form a Bears Ears coalition that is not led by the Sierra Club, but is empowered by Sierra Club helping the tribes who can actually go lead this. And so the tribes put forward the proposal, we then embraced it. We then lobbied the Obama administration to administratively set this aside as a national monument. And we were working on a management plan that would represent the tribe's interests in this area. And then Donald Trump was elected, and the Utah delegation came to him and said, this land was stolen from us. We want to see it all developed for uranium so that we can get maximum financial profit out of it. And so they did some quick and dirty hearings that the tribes and the Sierra Club and our allies all dominated, but nevertheless, our voices were ignored. And then they ultimately decided that they were going to remove the vast majority of the land so that it could be exploited and just leave a couple little isolated pockets for protection. Again, we joined with the tribes, and they were the lead plaintiffs, but we sued in order to stop this abuse. That litigation has been ongoing, and in the process, they have been unable to tear up the land over the last 4 years. So our hope is that, when Trump leaves office on January 20, that one of the first things Joe Biden will do when he comes in is to reinstate the original boundaries and the original protection and go back and work with the tribes in order to see that this land is protected. But that represents a very different approach than the way that the Sierra Club used to do land protection. Mm-hmm. We used to just draw circles on maps and say, this is the area that we want to have as a new wilderness or a new national park, and never consulted with the Native Americans and other key stakeholders. And hopefully we've learned a lesson and can go back and fix some of the things that we did wrong over the succeeding decades, and then going forward, have this new justice approach represent the way that we promote land protection.
So talking of about litigation, I assume it's been a busy 4 years for you guys with the Trump administration. Has there been many lawsuits? I mean, what are we talking about here?
We're talking about hundreds of lawsuits brought by the Sierra Club and our allies. It's been the main thing that the Sierra Club, NRDC, every environmental group has been involved in, either as a plaintiff or a lead plaintiff in the whole thing. And Sierra Club, in the ones that we have brought, have been successful 97% of the time, which is a remarkable litigation record, but it also reflects just how slapdash the Trump administration was. They were so much in a hurry in order to undo things, and did it in such an unprofessional way that you could challenge them under the Administrative Procedures Act or the National Environmental Policy Act or the Endangered Species Act, because they hadn't dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's and met the key deadlines and done the transparency that was necessary. And even if there were Trump judges, and that's the majority of the federal judiciary now, if they saw that the Sierra Club arguments had merit. And as a result, most of the bad things that Trump was trying to do, he's been unsuccessful in doing. Which isn't to say that he hasn't done a bunch of damage, but most of it hasn't been implemented to the point that it can't turn around and be undone by Joe Biden. Ultimately, one hopes you would have a supermajority in the Congress so that you could actually undo Trump misdeeds legislatively, as opposed to just one executive does one thing, gets replaced by a different executive which undoes it, which goes back and forth the other way, but have Congress actually step in and permanently protect an area, which then would require another act of Congress in order to permanently undo it.
So I find it quite inspiring when I read about the efforts by the Trump administration to open up the Arctic National Refuge for oil drilling, and the fact that the major US banks turned around and said, okay, that's fine, but we're not willing to bankroll this or to fund it. So that came out of work from you guys. I mean, what's your thoughts towards this?
Well, again, I don't want the Sierra Club to take primary credit for anything. We have a coalition that works to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Leading that coalition is the Gwich'in Nation. These indigenous people from Canada rely on caribou that are in their native territory where they hunt them, but then they all migrate down to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in order to have their calves for a new generation of caribou that then come back and feed the people. And so the Gwich'in appealed to the Sierra Club and other environmental groups for help. And together we collectively devised a number of strategies. So how do we litigate to try to stop the seismic activity? How do we litigate to stop the leasing for oil and gas? How do we flood the hearing record with pro-protection messages. But at the same time, we also settled on focusing on the financial community. So how do you put pressure on the banks to say, don't give any money to any oil company that is going to be bidding on leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge? And so the Gwich'in, along with the Sierra Club delegation and others, went to the headquarters of each of these banks, as well as protesting at their branch offices, saying, get your money out of the Arctic. Don't be complicit in this. This is a bad investment financially because it's way too expensive and it's going to be litigated and you'll never get your money back, but also it's just bad for the earth and, it's not something that you should be supporting. At the same time, we also put pressure on the companies themselves. So we basically, went to the shareholders and said, you need to have shareholder resolutions and, tried to scare off various companies from even bidding on them in the first place, saying, we're going to boycott your stores, your gas stations and things like that if you turn around and do it. And as a result, it's unclear to us that even if they put forward these lease sales, that a bunch of oil companies would show up and want to do it because there's just so much grief associated with it. Similarly, when you look at the original companies that were willing to do the seismic work up there to see where would be the best places to drill and where would be the best places to lease, we basically went and put pressure on all of them, saying, don't you be the ones that are running this seismic work there, because if you do, there's going to be endless grief for you. And as a result, they've been backing off. So, at the end of the day, the main promoters of this are the state of Alaska, because if they have more oil and gas development, because the old Prudhoe Bay field is drying up, and their entire budget, as well as they pay every citizen that lives in Alaska an annual check from that oil and gas revenue. So they not only don't pay any state taxes, but they get a check every year for living in Alaska that comes from the oil and gas companies. But the oil and gas company money is running out because Prudhoe Bay is drying up. So they want to go see the next big oil field there and the next big pipeline coming down that will keep their state coffers filled and those checks continuing to go, which buys votes from all the people in Alaska. And they're the only ones that seem to be promoting this, but they aren't going to bid on the leases and drill. And so, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, but hopefully, that never comes to a lease sale because Biden can head it off. But, we've got them in so many different vices from so many different angles. I'm fairly confident. We've been heading this off, frankly, since 1968.
Wow. When
they first started looking at trying to drill. When we passed the Alaska Lands Act in 1976, it created wilderness in most of the Arctic refuge, but part of the compromise of getting it through was it still allowed the Arctic coastal plain undetermined. It wasn't designated wilderness, and its fate was left open. And since then, there's been this dance where every year we put in a bill to designate that area wilderness and put it completely out of bounds, and they put in a bill in order to open it up and drill it. And since 1976, that's never been resolved. Neither side has been able to win until Trump got in and they snuck in a bill that was language in their big millionaires tax cut bill that basically said, and the revenue that's going to offset this billionaires tax cut is perceived revenues from drilling the Arctic. And that passed the Republican Congress, and that's how they got it through, and that's how Trump signed it. And we've been now living with that, trying to figure out how to go undo it. But it was a dark of night amendment on an unrelated bill in order to get it through, because they could never get it through if it was freestanding.
Wow. Well, thankfully you guys are, staying on top of this.
Well, not just us again. Let's not reward the Sierra Club. It's a group effort, and everybody's been involved in this for a long time.
Yeah. Thank you. And so do you have any advice for the incoming Biden administration?
Oh, sure. How much do they want? The Sierra Club has been part of a broad coalition, not only with other environmental groups, but also progressive groups and frontline communities, in order to look at a whole series of amendments recommendations for every department. So what should happen in the State Department? What should happen in the Agriculture Department? What should happen in the Interior Department, the Forest Service, the Park Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, who would be good people to appoint? What are the key policies that you ought to be promoting legislatively? What are the key executive actions that you ought to take in the first 100 days? So it's not just a matter of rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, but how do you stop a timber sale in the Tongass National Forest? How do you reverse the decision and reimpose the original boundaries and protection for the Bears Ears National Monument? How do you undo the damage that they've done to various EPA regulations on everything from pesticides to soot? So there's an enormous agenda, and it's basically starting by undoing everything that Trump was doing, because he hardly did anything positive in all 4 years. But then on top of that, how do you then turn around and actually build on that? Because it's insufficient to just go back to Obama-era initiatives. You've got to go far greater and have bigger aspirations and really come up with long-term solutions. That, Obama was too tepid and too timid, and he's one of my heroes. But at the end of the day, I think one of the lessons was, he spent too much time trying to work with Mitch McConnell, and he gets snubbed every twist and turn. And Joe Biden needs to learn from that, and he can put out an olive branch for the first month. But if Mitch McConnell's just going to be the Grim Reaper, then he just needs to push him aside and move forward and say, I'm going straight to the American people. We're going to show them what real progress looks like, and hopefully they'll recognize that's so important that they'll change the makeup of the Congress and get Mitch McConnell out of his powerful position.
And can I ask you, for a young person seeking a career in conservation, what advice would you give them?
I don't think it matters what kind of academic training you have. What you need is passion, and what you need is a commitment to participation in our democratic processes and lifting up other voices and joining together to solve problems. So whether you have a law degree or no degree, whether you've got an environmental policy background or a background in, social change or, just psychology, it doesn't matter. There's a place for you in the environmental movement. And when I was conservation director and had 500 people working for me, I never looked at the academic background. I wanted to see, what did you do with your life? Mm-hmm. If you were organizing for housing justice, you were a candidate for a job at the Sierra Club. If you were working in order to, help poor people or, work with labor and partnership in order to get a living wage, those are all great qualifications. Were you active in political campaigns? What have you done as far as your own participation in government and in public policy change? But we don't hire scientists. We don't, I'm a wildlife biologist by training. I've never used that in my entire Sierra Club career. When people ask, what's my occupation, I tell them I'm a professional agitator. And that's what I'm looking for in people that are applying. Are you interested in change? Are you good at change? Are you good at working with people? Are you good at inspiring people and communicating with people? In which case, you've got a future in the environmental movement or any other progressive cause.
Thank you for that sound advice. So I know in closing, I know you're a very avid book reader. So I'm curious to know what kind of books you would recommend people to read.
Well, I'm going to be boring. The book that inspired me the most in my life, and what I continually go back and read, but I don't believe that it's something that necessarily everybody would get a kick out of, is something called the Sand County Almanac. This is by Aldo Leopold. It comes from the 1950s, and it's basically the story of a wildlife biologist who was trying to restore a piece of abused land in the sand counties of northern Wisconsin. And in the process of bringing that land back to life, he then learned about man's relationship with nature and with ecological principles. And then from there, he developed an entire philosophy that led to him helping to found the Wilderness Society and other things, and he became one of the founders of the environmental movement. But the writing is poetical. I mean, John Muir's writing is too flowery for me and too woo-woo. But, Aldo Leopold's just sings. And there are so few environmental advocates. You can get angry ones that write diatribes. But, Aldo Leopold just had a way of talking about nature and talking about people and talking about a land ethic. That's something that just brings out my heart. He talks about what good is having grizzly bears alive if they're only found in Alaska. I may never get to Alaska, so we've got to try to figure out how to protect grizzly bears in the lower 48 as a way of being whole as people. What's inspiring about the fall migration, and you hear this goose music overhead, and it just resonates with you and somehow changes your whole attitude towards life and everything else. And, as a wildlife biologist and somebody who is primarily inspired by nature, that really gets to me. Now, the flip side of it is rules for radicals, because Aldo Leopold was not an organizer. And, he was a philosopher, he was a biologist, but he wasn't a real rabble-rouser, and Saul Alinsky was. And so even though Rules for Radicals focuses on his work for housing justice in Chicago, it ultimately led to the founding of the Midwest Academy, which is one of the most important organizing forums that exists anywhere in the country. And so the Sierra Club recommends that our budding organizers go to the Midwest Academy or go to the Highlander Institute. These organizing training sessions that were founded and produced people like Martin Luther King. And they're really important because they promote the idea of lifting up voices and finding out where people come from and what motivates them and how to make it easy for them to participate so that you get maximum public involvement and ultimately maximum public pressure. There's two kinds of pressure in this country, the power of money and the power of people. We'll never have as much money as our opponents, and Rules for Radicals talks about how to mobilize and organize and recruit and ultimately empower the people that can ultimately prevail.
Thank you, Bruce. So do you have any final remarks that you'd like to make, please?
Well, I would just urge everyone not to presume that somebody else is going to protect the environment and the earth and promote climate justice for you. It's insufficient to just presume that because you've got a Bruce Hamilton on the watch, therefore the problems are solved. We need many more voices, many more people, everybody involved and engaged. I spend most of my time trying to bring in the next generation and the next generation because, it's important. I failed you. My generation is handing over problems that are just unfathomable. And my apologies. But together we have to solve these. I'm going to spend my remaining days on Earth trying to solve them, but I can't do it without a whole army of people. So in whatever way you want to participate, whether you're involved in recruiting candidates, running for office, joining an environmental organization, joining a justice organization or some other progressive cause, working through your labor union, joining the Sunrise Movement, the Extinction Rebellion, I don't care what it is, but just be involved and be engaged because we can't win without everybody.
Thank you. And this has been a really inspiring interview for me personally. I'm going to make sure I join the Sierra Club today to support the work you guys are doing. So thank you again for the time that you've taken to speak to us, and we wish you the best of luck in the future.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for broadcasting this.
Take care.
Bye.
My name's Kirsty. If you enjoyed the content today and would like to watch more videos like this, please subscribe to our social media channels or join us at www.f.live/join.